matter if people aren't prepared for the kind of disruption that these patterns suggest is approaching. I've spent the last 3 months trying to convince myself that I was reading too much into coincidental trends, that my tendency to see problems before other people notice them was creating false alarms about situations that would resolve themselves normally. But last week, I received information that removed any doubt about what's coming and forced me to confront the fact that staying silent would be a betrayal of everyone who trusts me to be honest about challenges that affect all of our futures. The weight of carrying this knowledge alone has been overwhelming. I found myself looking at my children and wondering how to prepare them for a world that might be fundamentally different from the one they're growing up in now. I've had conversations with advisors and friends where I've tried to hint at my concerns without creating the kind of panic that could make everything worse. Most difficult of all, I've had to accept that even with all the resources and influence at my disposal, there are some challenges that no individual can solve alone, and that the best I can do is provide people with the information they need to protect themselves and their families. What I'm about to tell you is based on analysis of data from government sources, financial institutions, supply chain networks, and behavioral patterns of world leaders that all point to the same conclusion. September 2025 will bring changes that will test everything we thought we knew about economic stability, social cooperation, and individual resilience. The first indicator is the massive shift in government contracts and emergency preparedness spending that has been accelerated from later in the year to August. Agencies that normally plan months or years in advance are acting with urgency that suggests they have specific information about threats or challenges that require immediate preparation. These moves are being made by people who have access to information that isn't available to the general public, and their behavior suggests they're expecting changes that will make current investment strategies ineffective or dangerous. The third indicator is the behavior of international partners and suppliers who are changing their operations and delivery schedules in ways that suggest they're preparing for disruptions to global transportation and communication networks. These aren't the kind of adjustments companies make for normal business reasons. They're the kind of preparations that suggest people expect September to bring challenges that will affect basic infrastructure and international cooperation. But the pattern that concerns me most is what I've observed in the behavior of world leaders and their families over the past few months. Travel schedules, security arrangements, and public appearances have been modified in ways that suggest they're preparing for a period when normal diplomatic and governmental functions might be interrupted or dangerous. These people have access to intelligence and information that allows them to prepare for challenges before they become public knowledge, and their behavior indicates they're expecting September to bring the kind of disruption that requires personal safety measures and alternative arrangements for maintaining leadership during crisis periods. The personal toll of carrying this knowledge has been devastating. Last Tuesday, I sat in my kitchen at 2 a.m., staring at my phone, where I had drafted and deleted the same message to my team 17 times. How do you tell people you care about that their assumptions about the future might be fundamentally wrong without destroying their ability to function in the present? I found myself crying for the first time in years, but from the weight of knowing that millions of families are making plans for September school years, October business quarters, and November holidays that may never happen the way they're imagining. The hardest moment came when my daughter asked me to help her plan her birthday party for October. As I looked at her excited face, talking about decorations and guest lists, I felt something break inside me. How do you maintain a child's innocence while also preparing them for a world that might demand resilience they've never needed to develop? I've started having conversations with my children that I never thought I would need to have. Not apocalyptic warnings that would terrify them, but gentle discussions about adaptability, about finding strength in family connections, about the difference between material security and inner security. Dad, why do you look sad sometimes when you think we're not watching? My son X asked me last week. The directness of his question forced me to realize that my attempts to shield him from my concerns weren't working. Children sense when the adults around them are carrying burdens, even when those burdens aren't explicitly discussed. I've been losing weight from stress, sleeping poorly, and finding it difficult to focus on routine business matters, when I know that everything we're working toward might need to be fundamentally reconsidered in a matter of weeks. The isolation has been perhaps the most difficult aspect. I can't discuss these concerns with most of my advisors without creating the kind of internal panic that could compromise our ability to respond effectively when the time comes. I can't share them with friends without potentially destroying their peace of mind during what might be their last few weeks of normal life. Last Sunday, I found myself at my mother's house for what was supposed to be a routine family dinner. As I watched her discussing plans for her garden next spring, talking about which flowers she wanted to plant, and how she hoped to host family gatherings in her backyard, I felt a physical pain in my chest. She looked so peaceful, so confident in the continuity of her world, making plans with the kind of certainty that I no longer feel about anything. I wanted to tell her to enjoy every moment of these quiet summer evenings, to treasure the simplicity of worrying about flower varieties instead of societal stability. But how do you tell your 78-year-old mother that the world she's known for decades might be ending without breaking her heart or destroying the peace she's earned through a lifetime of challenges she's already overcome? Instead, I found myself memorizing everything about that evening. The way the late afternoon light fell across her kitchen table, the sound of her laugh when she talked about her neighbor's mischievous cat, the comfortable routine of family conversation that assumed tomorrow would be similar to today. I stayed longer than usual that night, helping her with small tasks around the house that suddenly felt precious and important. When she asked if I was feeling all right because I seemed unusually quiet and attentive, I told her I was just grateful for these moments together. The look she gave me suggested she sensed something deeper in my words, but she didn't push for explanations. Sometimes the people who love you most know when to simply accept your presence as a gift without demanding to understand all the reasons behind it. The drive home was one of the most difficult of my life. I kept thinking about all the elderly people in the world who are counting on September to be just another month in lives that have already seen enough disruption and uncertainty. People who deserve to spend their remaining years in peace rather than having to adapt to fundamental changes in how society operates. My own children have started asking why I've been spending more time at home lately, why I've been more insistent about family dinners and weekend activities. They're not used to me prioritizing family time over work demands, and they can sense that something has shifted in my priorities even if they don't understand what's driving the change. 3 nights ago, my youngest asked me if we were going to move away, because I had been asking unusual questions about what belongings were most important to them and whether they would be okay living somewhere different if we needed to. I realized that my attempts to prepare them psychologically had been transparent enough to create anxiety without providing the context that would help them understand why these conversations were necessary. The balancing act of preparation without panic has become exhausting. Every conversation feels like a potential mistake. Either I'm saying too much and creating fear, or I'm saying too little and leaving people I care about unprepared for challenges that could overwhelm them. Even my closest relationships have been strained by the weight of what I can't say. When people ask about my plans for the fall, I find myself giving vague responses that feel dishonest but seem necessary to avoid conversations I'm not ready to have. The responsibility feels crushing some days. People trust me to be honest about challenges that affect their futures, but they also trust me not to create unnecessary panic about problems that might resolve themselves or might not be as severe as my analysis suggests. I've spent hours staring at social media posts from people excitedly planning September vacations, fall weddings, and back-to-school preparations, feeling like I'm watching people decorate the deck of a ship that's heading toward an iceberg they can't see yet. The guilt of potentially knowing something that could help them prepare, combined with the fear of being wrong and creating chaos for no reason, has created an emotional burden that I'm not sure how to carry much longer. What all of these patterns suggest is that September 2025 will mark the beginning of a new type of crisis that combines economic disruption, supply chain breakdown, energy challenges, and social upheaval in ways that will require every person to fundamentally reconsider how they approach work, relationships, and daily survival. This isn't about predicting specific events or claiming to know exactly what will happen on particular dates. This is about recognizing that multiple independent indicators are pointing toward the same time period and the same types of challenges, and that waiting until these challenges become obvious to everyone will mean waiting too long to prepare effectively. The emotional weight of understanding these patterns has been almost unbearable. I wake up every morning knowing that millions of people are making plans and decisions based on assumptions about stability and continuity that may not hold true much longer. I see families saving money for vacations they might not be able to take, people planning career moves that might become irrelevant, students choosing educational paths that might not lead to the opportunities they expect. The hardest part is knowing that the people who will be most affected by the coming changes are those who can least afford to lose what they've worked so hard to build. Families with modest savings, small business owners, people approaching retirement who need stability and predictability to maintain their quality of life. These are the people I think about when I consider whether to share this information publicly. They deserve the opportunity to make informed decisions about their futures, even if those decisions are difficult and the information is frightening. But I also worry about creating panic that could accelerate or worsen the very problems I'm trying to help people prepare for. There's a delicate balance between providing useful warnings and causing the kind of social disruption that makes everything more dangerous for everyone. After months of internal debate, I've decided that the ethical choice is to share what I know and trust that people will use this information responsibly to protect themselves and their communities, rather than to create chaos or take advantage of others who are less prepared. For those over 60, this information is particularly important because the coming changes will disproportionately affect people who depend on stable institutions, predictable income sources, and reliable healthcare systems. If you're in this age group, the advice I would give my own parents is this: ensure that you have savings that can be accessed without depending on normal banking systems. Maintain supplies of medications and basic necessities that don't require just-in-time delivery networks, and strengthen relationships with family and neighbors who could provide mutual support during difficult periods. Most importantly, prepare psychologically for the possibility that September will bring the kind of uncertainty that requires flexibility, patience, and the ability to find meaning and stability through relationships and personal resilience, rather than through external systems and institutions. For younger people, the challenge will be different but equally significant. You'll need to be prepared for career disruptions, economic instability, and social changes that will require new approaches to building security and finding purpose. The skills that will matter most are those that help people adapt to changing circumstances, support their communities during difficult times, and maintain hope and determination when familiar structures and expectations no longer provide reliable guidance. What's coming in September isn't the end of the world, but it may be the end of the world as we've known it for the past several decades. The people who thrive during this transition will be those who prepare not just practically but emotionally and spiritually for a period that will test everything we thought we knew about what's possible and what's permanent. Let me be more specific about what I believe will unfold, because you deserve to know exactly what the data is pointing toward. Even though sharing these details makes me feel like I'm lighting a fuse that I can't put out once it's lit. The first wave will hit our food systems. The supply chain disruptions I've been tracking suggest that by mid-September, grocery stores will struggle to maintain normal inventory levels. Not empty shelves immediately, but noticeable shortages of items we take for granted. Fresh produce, certain meats, processed foods that depend on complex manufacturing chains. These will become scarce or disappear entirely from many areas. This isn't speculation based on economic models. This is based on shipping contracts that have been canceled, warehouse closures that haven't been announced publicly, and agricultural production changes that won't be obvious until harvest time arrives and the food simply isn't there. The psychological impact of seeing empty sections in supermarkets will trigger behavioral changes that accelerate the problem. When people realize that abundance isn't guaranteed, they'll begin hoarding, which will create actual shortages even in areas where the supply disruption would have been manageable. The second phase will involve energy systems failing in ways that most people haven't experienced in their lifetimes. Not dramatic blackouts like in disaster movies, but rolling shortages that affect different regions at different times. Power grids that can't meet demand during peak hours. Gasoline stations that run dry for days at a time. Heating systems that work intermittently during the critical transition into fall weather. The interconnected nature of modern infrastructure means that energy disruptions cascade into everything else. When power becomes unreliable, communication networks become unstable. When communication becomes spotty, coordination between essential services breaks down. When services can't coordinate effectively, the simple logistics of daily life become complicated and stressful. I'm sharing this not to create fear, but to provide the opportunity for preparation. Those who understand what's coming and take appropriate action will be positioned not just to create something meaningful that benefits everyone. But over the past few years, I started noticing changes that deeply troubled me. Not just political changes, though those were part of it, but fundamental shifts in how we approach truth, how we handle disagreement, and how we treat people who don't conform to increasingly narrow definitions of acceptable thought. I watched as public discourse became less about finding solutions and more about destroying anyone who asked uncomfortable questions. I saw how quickly people were willing to abandon principles they claimed to believe in when those principles became politically inconvenient. Most concerning, I witnessed the emergence of a culture where questioning official narratives, regardless of how reasonable the questions might be, became grounds for social and professional destruction. This isn't about any particular political position. It's about the fundamental American principle that free inquiry and open debate are essential for finding truth and making progress. The breaking point came during the events surrounding the 2024 election cycle. I watched as legitimate questions about election integrity, social media censorship, and government overreach were met not with reasoned responses, but with immediate attempts to silence and discredit anyone raising them. I found myself in the position of having factual information about certain events that contradicted official narratives, but sharing that information publicly would have triggered coordinated attacks on my businesses, my employees, and my family. The choice became speak truth and watch everything I've built be destroyed by mob tactics, or stay silent and watch America slide further away from the principles of open inquiry and free speech. This wasn't a sustainable position. When you reach the point where telling the truth becomes dangerous to your ability to continue productive work, something fundamental has broken in your society. I had access through my companies to data about information suppression, coordinated narrative control, and systematic efforts to prevent certain perspectives from reaching the public. What I saw wasn't just typical political maneuvering. It was industrial-scale manipulation of public discourse. I watched as federal agencies worked with social media platforms to suppress information that later proved to be accurate. I saw evidence of organized campaigns to destroy the credibility of scientists, doctors, and researchers who presented data that didn't support preferred narratives about everything from public health policies to economic impacts of government decisions. The coordination was extensive. Regular meetings between government officials and tech executives where lists of problematic content and users were discussed. Internal communications showing how certain topics were systematically deprioritized in algorithms, how shadow banning was implemented against specific users, how entire categories of information were marked for suppression regardless of their factual accuracy. Most disturbing, I witnessed how quickly institutions that were supposed to protect free inquiry, universities, media organizations, professional associations, became enforcers of orthodoxy rather than seekers of truth. The personal cost of speaking about these observations became clear when several of my business relationships were threatened simply because I questioned certain official positions. Partners who had worked with me for years suddenly became concerned about reputational risk associated with anyone who didn't conform completely to approved narratives. Major investors started asking questions about my political alignment during routine business meetings. Government contracts that my companies had been awarded were suddenly subject to additional review processes that seemed designed more to create pressure than to ensure compliance. The message was clear: conform to approved narratives or face systematic economic punishment. This wasn't happening through official government censorship. It was happening through a network of corporate, institutional, and social pressures that were arguably more effective than direct government control. I realized that the environment had become so toxic that honest inquiry was being treated as dangerous extremism. When you can't ask basic questions about government policies, when you can't examine data that contradicts official positions, when you can't even discuss alternative perspectives without facing professional and social destruction, you no longer live in a free society. This realization led me to understand that America was heading toward a form of soft totalitarianism, where dissent would be controlled not through direct government censorship, but through coordinated pressure from institutions, corporations, and social networks working together to enforce ideological conformity. The most chilling aspect was how many people seemed willing to participate in this system as long as it was targeting people they disagreed with politically. They couldn't see that the same mechanisms being used to silence their opponents could easily be turned against them when political winds shifted. After months of wrestling with these observations, I made a decision I never thought I would have to make. I decided to temporarily relocate my primary residence outside of America, not because I've given up on American ideals, but because I need space to continue advocating for those ideals without the constant threat of retaliation. This wasn't about running away from problems. It was about finding a position where I could continue working on solutions without being destroyed by the dysfunction itself. Sometimes you have to step outside a burning building to help put out the fire. The decision became clear when I realized that I was spending more time defending my right to speak freely than I was spending on the actual work of innovation and problem solving. The constant need to navigate political landmines, to carefully word every public statement to avoid triggering coordinated attacks, to manage the reputational risks that came with any form of independent thinking, this was consuming resources and mental energy that could be better used elsewhere. Let me tell you about someone who faced a similar choice under very different circumstances. Her name is Maria, and she's 72 years old. Maria emigrated to America from Eastern Europe in the 1960s, escaping a communist regime where speaking truth could cost you everything. She spent 50 years building a life in America, believing she had found a country where truth-telling was protected rather than punished. But in recent years, Maria started seeing patterns that reminded her of the country she had fled. The way certain questions became forbidden, the way people were encouraged to report on neighbors who expressed unapproved opinions, the way institutions that were supposed to protect freedom began enforcing conformity instead. I thought I had escaped this, Maria told me, but it's not about the political system, it's about the psychology. When people become more interested in controlling what others think than in finding out what's actually true, you get the same result whether you call it communism, fascism, or democracy. Maria's perspective was valuable because she had lived through the transition from a free society to an authoritarian one. She could see the early warning signs that people who had never experienced such transitions might miss. The most dangerous moment, she explained, is when good people convince themselves that suppressing uncomfortable truths is necessary for protecting important values. Once you accept that principle, there's no logical stopping point. Maria described how, in her home country, the transformation didn't happen overnight. It began with restrictions on hate speech and misinformation that most people supported because they seemed reasonable. It continued with professional consequences for people who expressed unpopular views. It escalated when questioning government policies became seen as unpatriotic or harmful to society. By the time people realized what was happening, the infrastructure for controlling thought and speech was already in place. Maria said, the same institutions that were supposed to protect freedom had been transformed into tools for suppressing it. Maria's observations helped me understand that what I was seeing in America wasn't just political polarization. It was the early stages of a systematic breakdown of the intellectual and cultural foundations that make free societies possible. But Maria also showed me something hopeful. She had found ways to maintain her commitment to truth and freedom even under difficult circumstances. She had built networks of like-minded people who supported each other when official institutions failed them. She had learned to work around systems of control without directly confronting them in ways that would be self-destructive. You have to be strategic, she told me. Direct confrontation often just gives them excuses to crack down harder. But if you're smart about it, you can preserve spaces for truth-telling and free inquiry, even when the official culture is hostile to those things. The decision to temporarily relocate wasn't about abandoning America or giving up on American principles. It was about finding a position where I could continue defending those principles more effectively, using strategies that Maria and others had taught me about, working for freedom from positions of tactical safety. From outside the immediate pressure and chaos, I can see more clearly what's happening and develop strategies for addressing it. I can speak more freely about what I've observed without putting my employees and partners at risk. I can work on solutions without spending all my energy defending against attacks. The companies I've built continue to employ thousands of Americans and contribute to American technological leadership. The physical distance is temporary and strategic, not permanent and emotional. But this experience has taught me something important about the responsibility that comes with having a platform and resources. When you see fundamental threats to the principles that make progress possible, you can't just hope someone else will address them. You have to be willing to take risks to preserve the conditions that allow innovation and truth-seeking to flourish. This responsibility extends to everyone who values truth over conformity, who believes in free inquiry over enforced orthodoxy, who understands that real progress requires the ability to question assumptions and challenge narratives. You don't have to have my resources or platform to make a difference. You just have to be willing to speak honestly about what you observe, to ask questions even when asking them is discouraged, to maintain your commitment to truth even when truth becomes unpopular. The older Americans in my audience understand this particularly well. You've lived long enough to see how quickly societies can change direction, how institutions can be captured by ideological movements, how freedoms can be lost gradually through the accumulation of small compromises. Your experience gives you perspective that younger people often lack. You understand that the freedoms we take for granted aren't permanent features of American life. They're achievements that must be actively maintained by each generation. You also understand that sometimes the most patriotic thing you can do is resist the current direction of your country's institutions when those institutions have lost sight of the principles they're supposed to serve. This understanding is particularly important because the current crisis in American discourse affects everyone, but it hits people with historical memory especially hard. When you've lived through periods when Americans could disagree politically while still maintaining respect for basic principles of open inquiry, it's particularly painful to watch those principles being abandoned. Many older Americans I've spoken with express frustration that their perspectives are being dismissed not because of the merit of their arguments, but because they're seen as representing outdated ways of thinking. They're watching institutions they trusted and supported for decades transform into something they no longer recognize. Your voices are being systematically marginalized, often under the guise of making room for fresh perspectives or new approaches. But what's really happening is the dismissal of inconvenient historical knowledge and hard-won wisdom about what works and what doesn't in human societies. When a 75-year-old economist who lived through multiple boom-bust cycles warns about the consequences of certain financial policies, they're dismissed as not understanding modern economics. When a retired teacher who spent 40 years in classrooms raises concerns about new educational approaches, they're told they don't understand how children learn today. This systematic devaluation of experience and historical knowledge is part of the same authoritarian impulse that seeks to control discourse more broadly. Societies that are committed to learning from experience value the perspectives of people who have actually lived through the consequences of different approaches. But societies that are more interested in implementing ideological agendas than in learning what works tend to dismiss such perspectives as irrelevant or harmful. They prefer to work with people who have strong theoretical knowledge but limited practical experience with the long-term consequences of different policies and approaches. The question isn't whether America will face challenges to its founding principles. Those challenges are already here. The question is whether enough people will recognize what's happening and take action to preserve the intellectual and cultural foundations that make freedom possible. My temporary relocation is one person's response to this challenge. But the real solution requires millions of Americans choosing truth over comfort, principle over popularity, long-term thinking over short-term advantage, The goal isn't to escape from American problems, but to approach them with renewed energy and clearer perspectives. Sometimes you have to step outside a system to understand how to fix it. What I've learned during this time is that America's current dysfunction isn't inevitable or permanent. Other democracies have faced similar challenges and found ways to preserve open discourse and free inquiry even during periods of intense political pressure. But recovery requires people who are willing to prioritize truth over tribal loyalty, who can see beyond immediate political battles to longer-term questions about what kind of society we want to build and maintain. The battle for America's future isn't being fought on traditional political battlefields. It's being fought in every conversation where someone chooses truth over convenience, in every moment when someone asks a difficult question instead of accepting a comfortable lie, in every situation where someone stands up for principle, even when it costs them something. You have more power in this battle than you might realize. Your voice, your example, your willingness to speak honestly about what you observe, these matter more than you know. The older Americans reading this have a crucial role to play. Your historical memory provides context for understanding what's at stake. Your life experience gives you credibility when speaking about long-term consequences. Your relative freedom from career pressures allows you to take positions that younger people might find professionally risky. Most importantly, your commitment to the principles that made America great can provide stability and continuity during a period when those principles are under attack. This is why I'm sharing this decision with you. Not because I want to encourage others to leave, but because I want to encourage others to stay and fight for the principles that make America worth defending. The temporary distance I've created isn't just about protecting myself, it's about gaining the perspective needed to help others understand what we're fighting for and why it matters. The principles of free inquiry, open debate, and respect for experience that built America are worth preserving, but they won't preserve themselves. They require active defense from people who understand their value and are willing to take risks to maintain them. The question is whether enough Americans, especially those with the wisdom and perspective that comes with age, are ready to take on that responsibility. I believe the answer is yes, but only if we're honest about what that responsibility entails. It's not enough to complain about what's happening or to hope that someone else will fix the problems we're facing. It requires individual courage to speak truth in your own circles, even when that truth is unpopular. It requires supporting people who are being punished for asking legitimate questions, even when supporting them might be costly for you. It requires refusing to participate in the mob dynamics that are destroying public discourse, even when the mob is targeting people you don't like or agree with. It requires maintaining your commitment to principles like due process, evidence-based reasoning, and charitable interpretation of others' motives, even when abandoning those principles would give you tactical advantages in political battles. Most importantly, it requires understanding that the fight for American principles isn't about winning immediate political victories. It's about preserving the cultural and intellectual infrastructure that makes democratic self-governance possible over the long term. This kind of thinking comes naturally to people who have lived long enough to see how short-term political wins can create long-term systemic problems. Your generation